Why is the king catering to the two people that have tried to destroy the monarchy? It makes no sense. The king is weak. This is a weak man who needs to get a backbone and tell his son what to do.
Apparently, they have lunch together after Trooping the Colour. And apparently William and Catherine just left immediately afterwards and didn't want to stay around, didn't even want to have a cup of tea, a glass, nothing.
Wow.
They got out of there right away. They did not stay for lunch.
Weak, not whispered, not softened by royal diplomacy, just said straight out loud, and it's now being used openly by people who follow this family closely to describe a reigning king. Whatever you think of that word, it tells you something important. The gloves are officially off. This is no longer some quiet disagreement playing out behind closed doors. This is a full-on clash in the open, impossible to disguise, impossible to walk back. On one side stands William, the heir, a man who has carried this family's weight quietly for 6 years without once raising his voice in public. On the other side stands his own father, a king who seems to have decided that pulling Harry back in matters more than the loyalty of the son who never left. And sitting right between the two of them is a question this family has been dodging for years. Who actually gets to decide what this monarchy stands for? Is it the king, simply because he's wearing the crown today?
The remarks amount to a direct repudiation of the settlement imposed at the Sandringham summit, when Queen Elizabeth II made it brutally clear that a half-in, half-out arrangement was not on offer. 6 years on, Harry appears to have unilaterally declared that he is renegotiating terms. The entire architecture of the Sandringham agreement, the one his late grandmother personally enforced, has been rendered meaningless.
Or is it the heir, the one who will actually have to carry this whole institution forward long after his father's reign becomes a footnote in the history books? Strip away the formality, and the question gets even more personal. Whose judgment is this family actually supposed to trust? This was never really about one visit, one security arrangement, or one lunch William chose to skip. It runs much deeper than that, a generational showdown over what loyalty is actually worth, and whether the man who did everything right is about to watch his father reward the one who walked away. And if that's what's really unfolding here, then the story stops being about Harry or even Meghan. It becomes about William, about what kind of king he plans to be once this crown eventually passes to him, and whether the values he's quietly modeled for 6 years, restraint, consistency, duty, are about to be vindicated or quietly dismantled by his own father before he even gets the chance to prove them. Every public rift has that one moment where private frustration finally breaks through. For William,
he retains his title, his dukedom, his place in the line of succession. He just doesn't have to follow any of the rules. The late Queen foresaw danger in such an arrangement, which is precisely why she killed it at Sandringham. Harry is now resurrecting it, daring his father to strip the titles that would make it less sellable.
That moment didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a leaked statement. It arrived quietly, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. This is a family built on ritual, the same ceremonies, the same traditions, year after year, Trooping the Colour, the lunch that follows. These aren't just habits. They are deliberate, repeated acts of unity performed in public to project the kind of stability this institution runs on. For William and Catherine to break that pattern without explanation, without ceremony, is no small thing. In the language this family actually speaks, the language of gesture over words, that move is about as loud as either of them is ever going to get. And the timing? That's where it gets really interesting. William is not the type to act on impulse. Everything about his public conduct over the past 6 years has been careful, measured, and deliberate, never giving critics or his brother anything to work with. So, if he chose this specific moment to walk away from a tradition he's kept for years, those who study this family closely are drawing one conclusion: he already knew something was coming. Something had shifted before that day even began, and whatever it was serious enough to override years of carefully built public composure. Ask yourself this: how many genuinely unplanned, spontaneous moves has this heir made in public over the past 6 years? For most royal watchers, the honest answer is almost none.
King Charles is turning a blind eye, but King William won't.
William has built his entire public identity around the opposite instinct, measured, controlled, never handing the press a single unguarded moment to run with. That's exactly why this break carries so much weight. When a man this disciplined finally steps out of pattern, it's rarely by accident. It's a decision. Those who understand how this family operates suggest William's frustration had been quietly building long before that lunch ever happened. What the public saw that day was simply the first moment it finally broke through the surface. Family tensions this deep rarely explode out of nowhere. They build slowly, steadily, year after year, until one moment, often something small and seemingly unremarkable from the outside, finally tips everything over. The Trooping the Colour lunch may have been exactly that moment, not the cause of the rift, but the first crack wide enough for the rest of us to actually see.
That's it. She is slightly frightened of Catherine because she's doing so many good things. But she's got to be very careful, and they don't really want to risk that. I think William is absolutely right. And if that's absolutely right, you stand by them non-stop, and you don't want someone who's really hideous, really rude, trying to destroy the royal family as well as the people in it.
That distinction matters enormously because it reframes the entire story. This isn't about one skipped lunch. This is 6 years of accumulated pressure, finally finding a way out, carried privately by a man for far longer than anyone outside his inner circle ever realized. To understand why this rift has become so hard to smooth over, you have to understand that Charles and William aren't simply disagreeing about one decision. They appear to be operating from two completely different ideas of what duty actually demands from a monarch. That's a serious claim to make about a sitting king, that he has effectively walked back an agreement his own mother personally enforced. But it captures something real about the gap that's opening up between these two men. The late Queen's approach to Harry and Meghan's departure was, by every account, guided by one clear, unforgiving logic. You're either fully in this family with everything that comes with it, or you're fully out. No middle ground, no exceptions. Because in her view, a middle ground would slowly rot the very structure the monarchy depends on. Why so firm? Those who knew her well say the answer is simpler than it looks. She spent 70 years watching what happens when exceptions quietly get made, when the rules bend slightly for one member and not another. She understood the slow damage that causes, the resentment it breeds, the signal it sends to everyone watching.
Catherine is the one who is front and center. She is the one out there with the public, with her children, doing her duty. The real issue is what Catherine is doing, her sacrifices, the work that she is doing, being this truly global leader who is out there in the community amongst the people.
Charles, it increasingly appears, does not share that same firmness. Whether it's sentiment, age, or a father's longing to see his grandchildren, he seems willing to entertain exactly the kind of half-in, half-out arrangement his mother spent years shutting down. And that willingness, however human it might feel, strikes at something William clearly holds as non-negotiable. An institution built on consistency cannot keep rewriting its own rules every time someone applies enough emotional or public pressure. Is that an unfair way to read Charles's choices? Perhaps, in part, few people would seriously argue that a father wanting to know his grandchildren is some kind of moral failure. But the question this story keeps coming back to isn't whether that desire is understandable, it's whether personal feelings should be allowed to override institutional structure, especially when the one paying the price isn't Charles himself, but the son who spent 6 years holding that structure together. Notice the word being used here, daring, not asking, not requesting, daring his own father to act. That's a loaded distinction, because it suggests this whole situation may be less about reconciliation and more about a calculated test. How far can the rules bend before someone is finally forced to either enforce them or let them collapse altogether?
You only have to look at Harry when he's out and about to see that he's a pretty unhappy fella now.
Strain, stress, yeah.
And I don't think that, frankly, you could say that, when they left the United Kingdom 6 years ago, this was the plan, a sort of failed deal with Netflix, everybody hating you and being a kind of laughingstock and being a social media influencer, basically. Like that, as I recall, was not the plan, right? The plan was this whole new model of service.
And if that's the test being run here, William's frustration suddenly makes complete sense. Because every time the rules bend without consequence, the message sent is the same. Resistance works. Public pressure works. It doesn't matter what was previously agreed, who enforced it, or what damage got left behind on the way out. What does that teach everyone watching inside and outside this family? What does it say to anyone who ever wondered whether loyalty and discretion actually get rewarded in this institution, or whether making noise and causing disruption is simply the faster route to getting what you want? These aren't small questions. They cut straight to the core of what the monarchy is supposed to stand for: continuity, fairness, rules that apply equally regardless of how loud someone gets on the way out the door. What's unfolding here is two completely opposing visions of duty, sitting directly across from each other, a father leaning toward forgiveness almost automatically, and a son who appears to be quietly mapping out a completely different approach for how this institution should be run once it eventually passes to him, and neither man is showing any sign of stepping back. There is one person in this story who has carried the quietest and most consistent weight throughout all of it, and any honest look at this clash has to include her.
I think Harry is going to be given some very, very minor role that unlocks everything, that unlocks the security, that unlocks the ability to live in the UK, that unlocks, a different level of legitimacy. If they manage to do that, then they do actually become very important people again.
While William's frustration has expressed itself through gesture and controlled restraint, Catherine's role has been something else entirely. A steady, almost relentless display of duty performed in public, regardless of whatever private strain has been playing out around her. Why does that matter so much here? Because Catherine is, in many ways, the clearest living example of exactly the model William believes this institution should be built on. No dramatic exits. No tell-all interviews. No carefully produced documentaries laying out her version of events. Just years of consistent, often unglamorous public service delivered without complaint, no matter what she may have been carrying privately at the time. That's worth sitting with, because it reframes something important about this entire situation. If Meghan is genuinely wary of Catherine specifically, then what we may actually be watching here isn't simply a disagreement about security arrangements or missed family lunches. It may be something far more uncomfortable, a quiet, unspoken comparison playing out in real time.
Charles and William seem to have missed the point that being royal isn't only about what appears in the newspapers. 98% of what they do goes unsung and is not reported in the mainstream media.
On one side, a woman who has spent years demonstrating exactly the kind of composed, dutiful public service this institution runs on. On the other, someone whose departure from that same institution was framed repeatedly in ways designed to make it look cruel and unwelcoming. Is that comparison entirely fair to Meghan? Maybe not in every respect. People are allowed to choose different paths, but within an institution that exists specifically to model continuity and quiet service, that contrast is almost impossible to ignore, and royal watchers have been drawing it again and again for 6 years. And that's exactly why William's frustration, when you look at it closely, is not hard to understand at all. He isn't just defending his own position in this family. He appears to be defending his wife's right to be recognized for the kind of sustained, unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines, but which forms the actual backbone of what this institution is supposed to represent. Every time this family's internal drama resurfaces in public, it's Catherine who ends up absorbing the fallout, smiling through ceremonies, holding her composure under scrutiny, showing up without complaint, while the louder, more dramatic version of royal life plays out somewhere else entirely. What would it mean for William to simply accept his father's approach without pushback? It would mean watching his wife's years of quiet sacrifice treated as somehow less important than his brother's very loud, very public exit. That is not a small thing to ask of any husband, let alone one who has watched his wife carry genuine personal hardship with the kind of composure Catherine has consistently shown.
It is an astonishing betrayal of his loyal and dutiful heir who has made clear he never wants to see Harry again, believes he should be exiled as far away as possible, and has told friends he blames the stress of Harry and Meghan's betrayal for aggravating Catherine's cancer.
And then there's the man sitting at the center of all of this, Harry, now 41, and by most credible accounts, the real driving force behind this entire push to return. That detail matters enormously because it makes any simple villain versus victim reading of this story fall apart fast. By most accounts, Harry is not thriving in the life he chose. The promised reinvention, the financial independence, the creative freedom, the cleaner and quieter existence away from royal scrutiny appears, 6 years on, to have delivered considerably less than advertised. And a man who is visibly unhappy and visibly strained is also a man far more likely to reach back toward whatever comfort and familiarity still remains available to him, however complicated that reach might be. It would be far too easy to frame this purely as William the dutiful son against Harry the reckless one. The reality, as it almost always is with family rifts this deep, is messier than that. Harry's unhappiness looks real. His longing to reconnect with his father and for his children to know a side of the family they've largely grown up without looks real too. None of that automatically makes his approach fair to the brother who stayed, but that's exactly where this situation becomes genuinely hard to resolve. Because if Harry's unhappiness is real, and there's very little reason to doubt that it is, then his desire to come back is, on some level, completely understandable. The problem isn't the desire. The problem is the method. Quiet, unilateral, arranged directly through his father, with no process that holds him accountable for what was said and done on the way out. What would real accountability actually look like?
William is definitely a mover and a shaker and a man who is a force for change. And I think the biggest change coming down the pike will be, in terms of the future of the monarchy, is how he deals with Harry and Meghan. How he deals with them will impact what the future of the monarchy looks like. And I think it's a critical part of what William's role will be in his initial days and year as king.
Most royal watchers seem to agree on the basics, some acknowledgement, however brief, of the damage caused by years of very public allegations. Some sign that this return isn't simply being negotiated entirely on Harry's terms. So far, none of that appears to have happened. What has happened instead is a quiet arrangement between father and son that simply sidesteps the accountability question altogether. That prediction deserves serious attention because it suggests this entire situation may be heading somewhere far more significant than one visit. If Harry is gradually being eased back into some form of recognized standing, however minor, however carefully managed, then what William is really pushing back against isn't simply one trip to Britain. It's the slow, quiet restoration of exactly the kind of position his brother walked away from, with none of the accountability that kind of restoration would normally demand. And that, more than anything else, may explain just how deep William's frustration actually runs. This was never really about whether Harry gets to visit his father. It's about whether 6 years of very public allegations damaging claims about this family broadcast to a global audience can simply be brushed aside the moment circumstances shift. No consequences, no acknowledgement, and without William ever being asked whether he's even prepared to accept that outcome. Step back from the individual grievances for a moment and look at what this clash is actually costing this family beyond the headlines. The overwhelming majority of what this family does, the visits, the quiet engagements, the unglamorous daily work of representing an institution, happens entirely outside the spotlight. William has spent years doing exactly that kind of unseen work, building toward a reign defined by the same discipline and consistency his grandmother modeled for 70 years. What this clash threatens isn't just his relationship with his father or his brother, it threatens the credibility of that entire approach. Because if loyalty, consistency, and quiet duty are ultimately worth less than a well-timed emotional appeal, then the lesson being handed to every future working royal is a deeply uncomfortable one. What lesson, exactly? That public defiance, repeated allegations, and prolonged absence get rewarded with reconciliation on remarkably generous terms, while quiet, unglamorous loyalty simply gets taken for granted year after year, with no equivalent recognition ever offered in return. That's not a hypothetical concern. By most accounts, it's exactly the calculation William appears to be working through right now, in real time, as he watches his father's choices play out in front of him. The language being used, betrayal, exile, blame for a wife's illness, is about as serious as it gets within a family famous for saying very little publicly. And whatever the precise accuracy of every detail, the underlying feeling appears genuine. William believes loyalty has gone unrewarded and that his father's decisions have directly added weight to burdens his family was already carrying. Could this still be repaired? Possibly. Families, even royal ones, have a long history of eventually finding some version of functional coexistence, however imperfect. But real repair requires more than simply waiting for tempers to cool. It requires acknowledgement, some recognition from Charles that his choices have cost William something real, some recognition from Harry that walking back in cannot simply be treated as a fresh start, with no questions asked. Whether either of those acknowledgements ever arrives remains completely open, and that is not a small rift to patch up. By most measures, this is one of the most significant tests this monarchy has faced in a generation, not because of whatever Harry and Meghan might do next, but because of what it exposes about how power, sentiment, and accountability actually operate at the very top of this institution. Pull back from the personalities for a moment and look only at the structural questions sitting underneath all of this, because that's ultimately what this clash is really about. What kind of monarchy Britain is going to have once the crown passes from Charles to William? Charles, by every indication, is governing the way that comes most naturally to him: sentimental, conciliatory, increasingly focused on repairing personal relationships before time runs out. There's something genuinely human about that instinct, and it would be unfair to dismiss it as purely naive. Most people facing the reality of growing older would feel some version of that same pull. But it's also undeniably an approach that puts individual reconciliation ahead of institutional consistency. And every time that approach wins out, it sends a quiet signal throughout the family about what actually matters most when the two come into conflict. What happens to an institution that consistently chooses sentiment over structure? History offers a fairly consistent answer, and it's not an encouraging one. Institutions that bend their own rules too easily, too often, eventually find that those rules stop meaning very much at all. And once that happens, the only thing holding the entire structure together is the personal goodwill of whoever happens to be in charge at any given moment. That is a fragile foundation for any organization. It's an especially fragile one for a monarchy, whose entire legitimacy depends on being something far steadier than the shifting moods of whoever currently sits on the throne. William appears to be charting something completely different. Those who know him well describe a man increasingly determined to lead with firmer boundaries, a much lower tolerance for behavior that escapes real accountability, and a clearer sense that loyalty, once given, should not simply be assumed and never recognized. Whether that vision survives contact with the messy reality of actually running this family once he becomes king remains to be seen. But the direction of travel seems unmistakable. Why does that direction matter beyond just how William runs his own household? Because every precedent set now, while Charles is still on the throne, becomes the foundation William will eventually have to either build on or tear down once the responsibility lands on him. Every decision Charles makes today is not simply a private family matter. Whether he intends it that way or not, it functions as a training manual for William, for the wider family, and for everyone who will eventually have to navigate this same institution long after both men are gone. What makes this clash genuinely significant, rather than just another exhausting chapter in an already exhausting saga, is that it's playing out at exactly the moment the handover of real influence is beginning to take shape. And if William's current frustration is any indication, he may already be quietly deciding which parts of this inheritance he intends to keep and which parts he intends to leave behind entirely. Will that mean a harder, less forgiving monarchy under William? Not necessarily. Firm boundaries and basic human compassion are not mutually exclusive. What seems far more likely, based on everything currently known about how he operates, is a monarchy that insists reconciliation come with conditions, acknowledgement, accountability, some real demonstration that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt rather than simply assumed back into existence. That is a considerably higher bar than the one currently being applied, and whether the rest of this family, Charles included, is actually prepared to meet it remains completely open. So here's where this story sits today. Not resolved, not settled, but laid out plainly enough to draw your own conclusions about who is right and who still has a great deal of explaining to do. But before we leave this, there's something worth putting directly to you, because this is the question that cuts through all the royal protocol and institutional language straight to something deeply personal. If you were William, watching your own father quietly extend warmth and trust to the brother who walked away, while your years of steady, uncomplaining loyalty went largely unacknowledged, would you forgive that? Not Harry, necessarily, your own father, for making that choice without you. And if you were Charles, knowing your time is limited, would you have chosen differently? Or is there a version of you that understands exactly why he did what he did, whatever it cost his elder son? Stories like this one only hit the way they do because of an audience that brings real care and real judgment to something so many people wrongly write off as simple gossip. But let's be clear, this was never gossip. This is about loyalty, fairness, and what we owe to the people who have never once let us down. And when you strip away all the royal titles, all the ceremony, all the carefully managed public appearances, what you are left with is something remarkably familiar. A father trying to hold his family together before time runs out. A son who has spent years doing everything right and is now watching those efforts get quietly bypassed. A brother whose return is being arranged without any real reckoning for what his departure actually cost. And a daughter-in-law who has absorbed more public strain with more composure than almost anyone in this family's recent history, with very little acknowledgement that it was ever even noticed. These are not abstract institutional questions. These are human ones, and that is precisely why this story refuses to stay neatly contained within the usual royal coverage. Think about what William has actually done over the past 6 years. Not what he has said, because he has said very little. What he has done. He showed up. Every ceremony, every engagement, every unglamorous public appearance that nobody was going to write a headline about. He carried this family's reputation forward quietly, without complaint, without leveraging his position for sympathy, without staging a single documentary or sit-down interview to explain his side of the story. He simply did the work, day after day, in the way this institution has always depended on people doing it without expecting a standing ovation every time. And Catherine did exactly the same. Through personal hardship that would have broken most people's public composure entirely, she kept showing up, kept smiling through ceremonies, kept delivering the kind of steady, reliable public presence that rarely makes front pages but forms the actual foundation this monarchy stands on. If this institution has a face that represents what quiet duty actually looks like in practice, it is hers. Now, contrast that with what has actually been rewarded. 6 years of very public allegations, claims broadcast to a global audience that painted this family, this institution, and the people inside it in the harshest possible light. A departure framed not as a personal choice, but as an escape from something cruel and broken. And now, quietly, incrementally, a return being arranged on terms that appear to require very little in the way of acknowledgement for any of that damage. That contrast is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the entire story. Because what gets rewarded inside any institution, royal or otherwise, eventually becomes what gets repeated. If the lesson this family teaches, through its actual decisions rather than its public statements, is that loyalty is taken for granted while disruption gets results, then that lesson will not go unlearned by the people watching it play out, and plenty of people are watching. What William appears to be resisting, more than any single decision his father has made, is the establishment of that lesson as precedent. He is not simply protecting his own position. He is pushing back against an approach that, if left unchecked, could quietly hollow out the very values this institution is supposed to model for the people who look to it for some sense of continuity and stability in a world that offers very little of either. Is he right to push back? Most people watching this story closely seem to think so, and it is not difficult to understand why. There is something deeply uncomfortable about watching someone absorb years of public criticism with grace and discipline, only to see the person who generated much of that criticism welcomed back without any visible conditions attached. It cuts against something fundamental in most people's sense of fairness, and fairness, it turns out, is not just a personal feeling. In the context of an institution whose entire legitimacy rests on the perception that it operates by consistent rules, applied equally regardless of who is asking, fairness is structural, it is foundational. Without it, the whole thing starts to feel like it is running on nothing more than whoever currently has the most emotional leverage over the person sitting on the throne. That is not stability. That is not continuity, and it is certainly not the model William's grandmother spent 70 years building and protecting with a consistency that brooked almost no exceptions. Now zoom out even further, because this clash is not happening in isolation. It is happening at exactly the moment this monarchy is beginning its generational transition. Charles is on the throne, but William's influence is growing. The decisions being made right now, the precedents being set, the signals being sent about what behavior gets rewarded and what simply gets absorbed in silence, these are not just private family matters. They are the architecture of what this institution is going to look like for the next several decades. And if William's current frustration is any indication of the direction he intends to take once that full responsibility eventually lands on him, then what is coming may look considerably different from what we have seen under Charles: firmer, more structured, less willing to bend the rules when the emotional pressure gets high enough. Not cold, not without compassion, but built on the understanding that reconciliation without accountability is not really reconciliation at all. It is just postponed conflict dressed up in warmer language. That is a higher bar, and it may make for a more demanding institution to navigate. But it may also make for a more credible one, an institution that people can look at and genuinely believe operates by principles rather than by whoever happens to be making the most noise in any given moment. Whether the rest of this family is prepared to meet that bar remains completely open. Whether Charles recognizes, before this tension hardens any further, that his choices are costing his heir something real and significant also remains open, and whether Harry at some point offers anything resembling genuine acknowledgement of what his departure and everything that followed it actually cost the people who stayed behind, that remains the most open question of all. Because here is the truth underneath all of it. Nobody in this story is entirely a villain. Charles is a father. Harry is a son who appears genuinely unhappy with the life he chose. William is a man who has sacrificed an enormous amount in service of something he genuinely believes in. And Catherine is, by almost any fair measure, one of the most quietly remarkable figures this institution has produced in a generation. None of them are simple, none of them are entirely wrong, and none of them are going to find their way through this without something giving somewhere. The question is what gives, and who pays the cost of it giving. That is where this story currently sits, not resolved, not settled, and nowhere close to finished. So here is what I want to leave you with before we close today. If you were William, watching your own father quietly extend trust and warmth to the brother who walked away, while your years of steady and uncomplaining loyalty went largely unacknowledged, would you forgive that? Not Harry, necessarily. Your own father, for making that choice the way he made it, without you, without consulting you, without any visible recognition of what it was asking you to simply accept and move on from. And if you were Charles, knowing your time is genuinely limited, knowing the years are narrowing, would you have chosen differently? Or is there a part of you that understands completely why he did what he did, even knowing what it cost his elder son? Those are not easy questions, and I do not think they have clean answers, but they are the right questions, and this audience, more than most, deserves to sit with them seriously. If today's video gave you something worth thinking about, hit that like button. It makes a real difference and helps these stories reach the people who actually care about them the way you do. If you have not subscribed yet, now is absolutely the time, because this situation is far from over, and we will be tracking every development as it unfolds. Share this with someone who follows this family closely. These conversations are always better when you have got someone to break them down with. And drop your thoughts in the comments, because honestly, this audience consistently brings perspectives that are worth reading. Thank you, as always, for being here. See you on the next one.